Well, I think we'll get going.
Okay.
I'm just going to introduce you, Larry. So hold on.
Yes.
It's a very great pleasure to have Larry Sitsky on a phone call with us from Canberra. Larry was not able to come and join us. And Larry was born in 1934. He eventually came to Australia and settled in Sydney, and he studied here at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. And that's where he met Dennis Condon, and we were having a chat about that. He has worked very closely with piano rolls and actually contributed with a book, which we are also going to talk about. But he was also a composer. He's written numerous works for opera, theatre, orchestral music, chamber music, solo and vocal music. And he's been commissioned by many of the leading Australian and international bodies and has won prizes and has worked with many of the industry institutions such as Musica Viva, the Sydney International Piano Competition, and so forth. Larry has received numerous honours for his compositions as well as for his research. And he has been well supported by the Australian Research Council, amongst other granting bodies. Sitsky has been described as someone who has the intellect of a pure mathematician, the musical faculty of a prodigy, and the warm humanity lacking in many modern musicians. But he's not one to hold back. He's the sort of person who likes to stick pins into the system, and the examples of Sitsky versus bureaucracy are numerous. That might give us a sense of Larry Sitsky's character. Welcome to our keynote with you, Larry. It's very nice to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
I might just start off, because we are here at a piano roll meeting conference. Could you tell us how you became interested in piano rolls?
Yes, I was just finishing studies in San Francisco with Egon Petri, the great pianist, and he charged me with carrying the torch and continuing the tradition into which I'd just been initiated. And so in Australia, when I got back to my first job, which was in Brisbane at what I call the Preservatorium of Music, what happened was that I worked and wrote my first book, which was a biography of Ferruccio Busoni. And in it, of course, I had to write something about Busoni's recorded legacy. And so this is where I first came across an obvious problem. Yes, I knew he'd made some rolls. I'd already heard one or two. But I discovered that there was no coherent catalog or a way of discovering what was about and what was recorded. And we were in great danger of losing a lot of the information. A, because the rolls were on paper, obviously fragile, but B, also because some of the actual companies that had made it and made rolls were starting to discard the product because somewhere when the Depression came in, anyway, somewhere around that time, rolls began to drop out of most public consciousness, and a lot of piano roll players were being scrapped or used just for playing ordinary stuff. So anyway, so trying to discover and listen to all the Busoni rolls proved very difficult. And indeed, up to this day, there's one roll still missing that I haven't heard and don't know if it still exists. We can talk about that later.
Okay, yes.
So, go on.
No, keep going, keep going.
I was going to say that's when I started seeing what was available in Australia and contacting possible raw collectors who might have what I was after. And that's when I renewed my friendship with Dennis Condon.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis and I were fellow students at the Sydney Con, which was then known as the State Conservatorium of Music. Dennis was training as a teacher. I think he had either an enrollment or a fellowship or something from the Teachers College. And he was never interested in becoming a performer himself.
Mm-hmm.
But our paths began to cross as I embarked on this search. And I remember he had a role of Busoni playing the Chopin G minor ballade. And I remember going to his place to hear it and being knocked out by it. So he was the right contact, so to speak. I'm sorry I interrupted your next question.
Well,
or second question.
Well, I was going to say, if we could we'll come back to Dennis Condon and your friendship and also about Dennis in a second, but I just wanted to mention that your catalog, which is called the Classical Reproducing Piano Roll, a catalog index, was published in 1990. And
yeah.
Maybe you could just say a few more words about what was involved. I know what was involved in getting the information together for that catalog. And how many years' work that was. I know that when I was doing my PhD in UK, I came across it actually in the British Library, and I referred to it many times, and it's in my book as well. It's a really important.
Oh, thank you.
It's a very important index. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the title actually limits what I was collecting, as it were, simply because of the huge number of other kinds of rolls. So I said classical reproducing piano roll, which meant that I wasn't going to mess around with jazz, about which I don't know very much. I would push it as far as some light music, perhaps. And it really meant that I wasn't going to touch other types of rolls or hand-cut. No, some hand-cut rolls are there. I'd already started to come across a really alarming thing. I remember trying to get material on the Pi-L system, and they had a system called Pi-L-A. Anyway, much to my horror, I got in touch with the Pi-L company, and someone in their company, in their wisdom, had opened all the files that contained details of the rolls they'd made, and decided this was a lot of old junk, and they just chucked them all out. So unless someone in your company there knows better, as far as I know, all the documentation of Pi-L is now gone forever, which is horrible, because the companies had things like not just the artist and the repertoire, but also details of when and locations and so on. So we lost all that.
Yes, we had a couple of papers earlier yesterday that were covering that very same topic. So if everyone here has been appraised of what was happening at the time. But we might ask you some questions about Dennis Condon, because obviously he was a really important figure here in Sydney and is now remembered for his extraordinary collection and the work he did and all the concerts that he held at his home, which so many people remember. How would you describe Dennis, and tell us about how he felt about piano rolls from your experience?
Well, Dennis was really single-minded, and for him that was the beginning and end of just about all music. He dedicated himself to collecting the machines and the rolls over many, many years, and had an extraordinary collection at home in Newtown, up on the second floor of a terrace house. I don't know whether you remember the place or wherever there. He was a very special combination of someone who was musically trained, but also very mechanically minded. And so he not only knew the music, as it were, but he knew how it was produced, and he would tinker endlessly with the machinery and knew how to fix it if something went wrong.
Yes, very importantly.
The pianos in his studio, well, they were all reproducing pianos, various very rare ones, including the Keeler, Velpe, and just about every variant of that you can imagine. And the upstairs room and the corridors were filled with shelves with piano rolls. He had, from memory, it was somewhere over 7,000 rolls. It might have been more, I can't remember. And what was amazing to me was that if you said to him, "Oh, do you have a roll of X playing Y?" he would go to the shelf and just pick it off the shelf. So he knew exactly where everything was. Dennis and I got together more and more as my interest grew. For a while, we kind of didn't see each other because he graduated and went on to teaching in various schools. And I went on to my first gig, which was in Brisbane. So there was a kind of hiatus. But once I began studying the rolls, the repertoire, and collecting them, then we reconnected again and spent a lot of time together. And I remember getting under pianos with him while he tinkered, just watching what he was doing and what he was adjusting. No, he was very special. And of course, well, he's no longer with us. And what happened was his medical bills climbed higher and higher. And after he died, his partner, Robert, we got together, and I'd always dreamt that we could put the stuff here at the ANU. Dennis always said and wished that the collection could stay in Australia. And of course, I wanted to do the same. So we had a kind of plan. And by then, I was also working with my ex-pupil, Geoffrey Lancaster, who was also fascinated by the notion of getting all these roles. And our plan was very simple. The Australian National University would house the roles and house my library of literature, Balkana rolls, which consisted of every catalogue you care to name. I had about 200 odd volumes of material. I'm very rare. So it was a very tempting kind of picture. And we pushed like mad for it. But in the end, there were a few factors. One was that we got tangled up with the ANU bureaucracy. And the other one was that we got tangled up with the ANU lawyers who decided that all that material was copyright. I don't know on what basis they came to that conclusion, but it started to impede what we were going to do. And I remember Geoffrey and I tried our damnedest to overcome all this. But in the end, after Dennis had died, Robert's view was that he couldn't wait much longer because the medical bills were still unpaid, and he had to find some way of paying them. And so he knew that he was going against Dennis's wishes, but, well, there was very little option. And so what happened was that we got in touch with a number of possibilities, and one was Stanford University. Stanford didn't muck around at all. They got together a group of 3, I remember, academics. They put them on a plane, send them to go to Dennis's place, look at all the material, all the rolls and pennants. They came here to my place, looked at all the 200 plus books, and next thing I knew, there was an offer, boom, boom, that was it. And Robert said to me that he was kind of heartbroken, but he had no option. Stanford, of course, is a very reputable university, and so both the rolls and the books are now reunited and in a very safe place. I just hope that it's going to be maintained and used in the way that I think it should be used.
I might just interject and say that, of course, we have our colleagues here from Stanford, and it's wonderful to have them. And we were saying yesterday that, I mean, you know, we even considered whether we could pay for the collection to stay and have it here at the University of Sydney, but there was no way of raising that amount of money in such a quick time. But the point to be made is that Stanford have the wonderful facilities and the infrastructure really to not only house all of this material, but also to keep it up in good condition and to use it. And the stuff that we've been seeing that they're doing is extraordinary. And the lovely thing, the availability of all of that information and data, to all researchers around the world, which is, of course, the strength of universities. It's sad that it's gone from Australia, but on the other hand, it's preserved and it's being used and it's going to be, available to everyone. So I think that's really wonderful. It's
in very good hands. And now and then I look online. Well, I can't look online anymore, but my wife does that.
Yeah.
And so I've kept an eye on what's developing and what they put out some press releases now and then. And so, yes, although it's not here, I'm very happy where it is.
That's great, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so what does one say? It turned out well.
Yeah, that's great. I might ask you, though, now this is we want to know what you think about this, given your interest in piano rolls over many, many years now. Can you tell us, for you, what value they have for us today?
Well, I've always thought of the rolls as a vast repository of information, going back to pianists as old as Reinecke.
Yes.
So the first half of the 19th century.
Yep.
And up to the very latest people that made rolls. So it's a vast repository of things like style, probably I'll put as number one. But on a roll, you've got so much more information. You've got, if you unroll the thing and study it, you've got information about pedaling. You've got information about rubato, about changes of dynamics. It's all there, not only for your ears, but actually on a piece of paper. So we need facilities, especially now, to scan everything, digitize it, and preserve the information. Because without it, we will have forgotten how 19th century pianists performed. So to me, it's all those things put together.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Oh, it definitely answers my question, and it's what we've been talking about here the last 2 days and also in all previous of the global piano roll meetings. So yeah, we're all in agreement with the value of them. And I wanted to ask also a question about how you see piano rolls becoming part of tertiary studies, piano studies, but also other studies. Obviously, you've been at the ANU now for a long time. How can we bring this into the studies and embed it into our curriculum?
You know, it should, well, to begin with, I found out that pianists in universities in this country, and maybe many other countries, they know very little about piano rolls, which has always amazed me because, well, they're piano rolls, so you would think that pianists would know all about it, or at least something. But I'm willing to lay bets that if you get pianists who are actively teaching, that their knowledge of what we're talking about isn't very deep, if at all. A lot of them still regard piano rolls with some suspicion because they don't think it's real recording. And I remember when Dennis was still alive, we did a series together on the ABC, and we decided we wouldn't explain that this was a roll, or this was a record, whatever, a record. We just called it a recording. And so we played various recordings, of course, with no surface noise. And no one actually queried it at all.
Yeah.
That was an interesting experiment on air. We just didn't use the word raw at all to call them recordings.
Yes.
It might have been a bit sneaky, but it actually proved my point that if you don't know, and if it's good quality raw with all the full expression markings, it's a recording.
Yeah.
But of course, one also needs to recognize that RAWs run a full gamut of just the notes to partial expression to full expression. And pianists need to know this to understand what information they can extract from a RAW. I'm also terrified of the idea that whether the RAW only has one wavy line or a lot of information about the resulting sound. I'm terrified that it's fragile, and I wonder whether somewhere we should start or agitate for a process of digitization of as much information as possible. Because to me, where there's a fully top-class company like Ampico or someone like that with beautiful results, or not such a hot company with partial information, or it just has a couple of wavy lines, it doesn't matter. It still embodies a lot of information.
Yes.
And instead of sniffing at it, we should be preserving it.
Absolutely.
It worries me that if we go through all our universities at any rate and speak to the pianists there, they still regard people like us as representing a kind of niche interest and not serious scholars.
I agree with you.
It hasn't changed, and it was there even when Dennis was still alive, and of course still there. So there we're failed, and we need to try and do something in the sense that anyone who teaches the piano or indeed studies the piano has to know about what we have and what information is available.
Yeah.
Because after all, it's tied in, unfortunately, with that authenticity movement that hit us all at the beginning and further into the 20th century. And so that did a lot of damage, I think.
Yes, it's true. It's interesting. My experience here at Sydney is that, well, for example, we have 3 days of this wonderful meeting, and pretty much only 2 of my colleagues have popped their heads in to the meeting, even though we made it very well known that this was here, and they understand, many of them understand the value of piano rolls. We've been banging on about it now for about 20 years, but they haven't really made an effort to come and listen to some of the wonderful results from the study of piano rolls. We just heard someone here who studies with Geoffrey Lancaster, actually, over in Perth. Nicholas Williams is his name. He just played us 2 of the Liszt legends based on Friedheim's performances on roll, and it was absolutely magnificent. And so I wanted to say that even though some of the generations of teachers are not taking up the mantle. I think that the younger generation coming through understand how important they are, and they hear the roles. This is my experience. They hear the roles and their eyes light up and think, oh, can I play like that also? And
yes, of course.
they love it.
Because the authenticity movement wrecked attempts at playing freely, because they laid down strict rules. Rubato wasn't a good idea, even though I think they were quite wrong in that human beings are human beings. But you know what I'm talking about. They had a kind of strict dictum about such matters, and we were an inconvenience in that regard.
Yes.
And we were preaching and teaching a 19th century performance style, not a neoclassically based movement. And so that also worked against us. Plus, of course, the Depression was the final nail in the coffin of the industry.
Yeah.
But we just need to plug along, because we're the guardians, if you want to think of it that way, of something very special.
Yes, indeed. I agree with you. I'm going to ask you another question now about how we go forward. So you will remember that you were one of the examiners of Peter Phillips' thesis a few years ago. And in which, he's asked this question, in fact, in which you commended the concept of digitizing piano rolls, and you've mentioned that you do now. What's your present view of piano rolls being played on contemporary pianos, such as the disc clavier, and the many types of virtual pianos that we have available to us?
Well, there's nothing to stop us from doing that. If the digital pianos have the full gamut of what we're after, yes, let's do it. I don't even mind if they put on recordings of partial digitization, and you sit at the piano and you add things like pedaling or whatever. So it can be a kind of symbiotic relationship. But naturally, the ideal situation is hearing it on the instrument for which it was recorded and played back, and which the pianist then signs the master role as representing their playing. But digital pianos would be a very good way, I guess, of preserving the material, and hopefully in a less fragile form. So I'd be the last person to argue against it. Yes.
Oh, that's great. I've got one more question for you, and because we've got about 15 minutes left to chat, and I want to see if anyone has questions for you. So I'll ask this question, and then we might open up to questions from the people in the room here. Obviously, we all know that one of your piano teachers was Egon Petri, who made many roles really on the Welter and also for Hupfeld. And could you say or talk about, did he ever talk to you about his roll recordings and what the experience was for him?
Yes, he did. First, I asked him, the early transfers had just come out when I went to Petri. Those early, it was Columbia, wasn't it? And there was a set of discs. Not good, but it's the first time that many people heard the rolls.
Right.
And the first thing he said I asked him what he thought about the representation of Pizzoni's performance. I can't remember what the piece was on those early LPs. And he was horrified. He says it was like a travesty of Pizzoni's playing. But of course, he heard this very early and very clumsy transfer.
Yeah.
and didn't live long enough to hear how advanced the transfer onto LPs and CDs gradually became. And his point to me was that what he heard was just the notes, the balance was wrong. And he said with Busoni, you always heard the melody and accompaniment in sharp relief against each other, plus all the, some people found outrageous rubato, plus the freedoms with the printed text. So his impression wasn't a good one. My other teacher, Winifred Burston, who taught at the place you're in now, he was a foundation member of the Sydney Con, and she went to Berlin in 1911 or 12 to study with Busoni, but unchaperoned, by the way. In an age where it was unheard of. But anyway, and she, of course, lived on into the 80s or somewhere there. And she not only heard Busoni play, but also Petri, and knew the style of playing very well. And so I remember letting her hear some more recent transfers onto LPs. And she was okay with all that. And she said it reminded her of what she remembered. So we had begun to move in the right direction.
Yeah.
Petri was just concerned that the huge talent that Busoni had wasn't represented, but also even things like the balance between melody and accompaniment weren't properly done. And he said the one thing that was always clear was that there was never any doubt which the main line was.
Right. Yeah.
So we've got somewhere in the intervening years, and I'm hoping, of course, that the book that I did, which was only limited to a particular kind of music, that someone does something similar with jazz, anything that I missed out. It's sitting there waiting for someone to actually do it, because that also would contain very valuable information. I would think the jazz guys would be knocked out.
Yes.
If they heard good reproductions of some of the early performers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really fascinating area, how jazz has evolved as well in the 20th century. I've always thought that to hear some early performers on rolls playing jazz would be fantastic. They must
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, look, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to just ask now if anyone has any questions, and we've got a roving microphone. So has anyone got a question for Larry? Yes. We might just give us a second to get the microphone to this person, and I hope you'll be able to hear.
G'day, Larry. Your book, The Classical Reproducing Role, is now out of print. Is there any hope that it's going to be back into print, or any thoughts on that one?
I haven't been approached by anyone. Naturally, I'd love to get it back into print. It's because publishers are dropping in and out of the whole business, aren't they? They're being bought out. And someone told me the other day that they wanted a copy of an early book of mine, and it was some outrageous price. And I remember saying to them, well, I wouldn't pay that much for the book. But you know, I'm not sure what one does. I don't want any money for a reprint. I wish they'd do it, though. There's a couple of small mistakes in it which can be corrected. And of course, Greenwood Press, which did my first book, which was on Busoni, well, they no longer exist. They were bought out. So somehow, someone would have to approach whoever holds the copyright to see if it can be reprinted or done in a online
Yes.
availability. I would do anything to help that, of course.
Larry,
as I say,
who holds the copyright, Larry?
it must be Greenwood Press.
Okay.
But Greenwood Press doesn't exist anymore. And so you'd have to find out who bought them out. Yeah, I can't remember now.
It sounds like a project. Sounds like a project for someone. We'll get someone onto it.
Well, yes, and if I can help, I'd love to. And as I said, there are a few smallish errors, and we could correct those. No, it would be great.
It's good to know that
I don't want any money.
Okay, it's good to know that you're enthusiastic about that idea, because we probably could get some people together to work on seeing who owns the copyright, if it's a problem, and then maybe get a digital version of it. And I don't know what we could do, but I'm sure that's possible. Must be possible.
Yeah, well, people have copies of the first edition, haven't they?
They have, yeah.
It's probably, well, it's in your library, I would guess, as well.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Is it in the Con Library?
I'm not sure if it's in the Con Library. I'll check it. I'll check it and I'll send you a message. I used it in the British Library. It was certainly there. So it's...
Yeah, well, of course, I have a copy here.
Yeah, we have another question for you. Just one second.
Yes.
Good day, Larry. We have met before. My name's George. I just wanted to ask you, in the context of the Oral Summit we're in, I was a big fan of your opera, The Golem, and I always thought that because where it was set, some Weimar cabaret kind of upright piano would have suited the score. I don't think you had any in there, but I'm just wondering if you have ever felt that your music could benefit at certain points from some tinkling, upright Weimar-style piano, because I think your style definitely would suit that thing. And just on the copyright, there are many recorded albums that unfortunately have gone into limbo because, as you kind of alluded to, the company that holds the copyright has actually disappeared, gone into liquidation. So you're not the only person who's had that particular limbo forced upon them.
No, that's I agree with everything you said there. See, even recording The Golem, we were given an option. This is the kind of straitjacket which composers have to deal with. I was told you can have a video of the Golem done, but you'll have one less rehearsal. And we needed the rehearsal because it's a complicated piece. And the conductor was very reluctant to let go of a rehearsal so that people could set up video cameras. So we opted for the rehearsal and recording of a live performance. and that's what was issued. But you know, the performance was excellent, and composers are. I used to say to my students, if you really want to be a composer, you have to get used to being kicked in the teeth every day, because these are the kind of options that are in your face constantly. And I remember interviewing someone who wanted to do composition when I was, among other titles, head of composition studies at what began as the Canberra School of Music and finished up at the ANU School of Music. And I remember one guy, we interviewed him, a colleague of mine and myself, and I was trying to get a raise out of him, some sort of commitment. And I said to him, if we don't accept you, do you have other options? And he started rattling off that he could do architecture or law or whatever it was. And I remember saying to him, oh, good, go and do it. Go and do something useful, which kind of took him aback. And he said, well, what do you mean useful? I said, well, digging ditches is useful. Being a composer, well, I can't vouch for its usefulness. He didn't know how to take it. I was trying to get a rise out of him to say, I don't care what you say, I'm going to be a composer. Well, he never said that. And so I thought, well, in that case, mate, you're not going to be one. Maybe cruel, but I think based on reality. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, that's great to hear that. We might draw this discussion to a close, and because we also have another event coming up, and people.
I'm sure you do.
But it's been wonderful to have you join us for this, and I'm so glad that you didn't say no, but we found an alternative way to hear what you had to say about piano rolls and Dennis Condon and all this very rich. And so I'd like to give a round of applause for Larry for joining us.
Thank you so much. Yes, I wish I could have been there, but we're not always in charge of what happens to us.
No.
And so, although I'm not totally blind, I'm very close to it. And so traveling and so on would have been a nightmare.
Yeah,
but it's all right. It's not getting me down at all, and I'm amusing myself in 100 different other ways.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
So, but look, those ideas that came forward, I might be able to help, let's find out and investigate what can be done.
Yep.
And I'll support it as much as I can.
Fantastic. We'll get onto that and be in contact with you. So thank you so much again for joining us and taking the time. We really greatly appreciate it, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Larry.